Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. Apologies for my late arrival. I can say it in sort of a few words, M25. Unfortunately, it's taken me 4 hours to get here from Guildford, which is unusual even for the M25. First of all, I want to say what an honour it is to be here, because this is my first official engagement as Chancellor actually on campus. So I'm very excited. I'm glad I made it. I'm delighted to be personally fronting this flagship lectureship series that brings internationally esteemed lecturers to speak here at the university. This is not only my first lecture under my chancellorship, it's also the first lecture of the year. And so I'm delighted to see so many people here. Now, there's another reason that I wanted to be here today, and that is because, not just because it's the first lecture of the series, but because this subject is very, very close to my heart. We all know the devastating impact that COVID-19 had on all of us. But here at Leicester, this was one of the first places to identify the disproportionate impact of COVID that was actually having on minority ethnic communities. And that sort of knowledge alone had a big impact. It had an impact nationally, and it also had an impact internationally. And because Leicester is a super diverse city, that observation by Professor Kamlesh Kunti had particular relevance and, yes, had ramifications all over the world. But the thing that underpinned that observation was data. And these conclusions cannot come about without good, robust data. And I think it's quite interesting that because behind the data, there were devastating stories of the impact it had on many, many different people's lives. I'm also aware, as Chancellor, that I want to pay tribute to my predecessors and also the brilliant lecturers that have gone on here before. The Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture Series was first set up by Lord Bruce in 2015 and was continued by my predecessor, Lord Willits. Previous speakers have included Sir David Attenborough, Patricia Cornwell, Lord David Putnam, Lord Robert Winston, and Lord Willits himself. And in November, Sir Patrick Vallance also gave a lecture. So, now, for someone like me who's familiar with stars, I must say that is indeed a rare alignment of glorious names. But I think that says something about Leicester, because this distinguished lecture, people are willing to come here to the University of Leicester and put their names to this lecture series. And because Leicester is cutting edge in many, many different fields, from the discovery of genetic fingerprinting, Richard III discovered in a car park here. And in my own field of space and astronomy, Leicester has a huge legacy of over 60 decades of space interest, and also over 90 missions. So that is a sort of an impressive array. The university has strengths and weaknesses, strengths across a range of different disciplines, and this is very much reflected in the range of speakers that actually come to this university. As well as astronomy, space and the environment, the university is very well known for its research in health. With partners, Leicester is playing a leading role in tackling health inequalities, including research into COVID-19, lifestyle diseases, respiratory illness, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and multimorbidity. According to a census of 2021, Leicester emerged as a plural city. I had to look up what that actually meant. And it actually means it's the first city in the UK to have no majority ethnic group. So it truly is diverse. And so with this unique position, it makes Leicester the ideal place for doing this sort of research, looking at these health inequalities. And because the city is super diverse, it has a high participation in the rate of trials, but also it has some of the most deprived areas in the country. And it's sort of working to sort of alleviate that. But it's quite interesting because people say, why did you become Chancellor of the University of Leicester? I live in Guildford. But I think Leicester was definitely a natural fit for me because we have shared values. Leicester inspires. It brings benefits of higher education to as many communities as possible. Education is truly transformative. It changed my life, and I love to see Leicester doing the same for others. Leicester has impact. Through research, entrepreneurship and education, it has enormous influence. It creates citizens of change, individuals that go out into the world and make the world a better place. But also, Leicester is inclusive. I believe passionately in this approach to make education accessible to all people. Education is the game changer that changes life, and so it should be accessible to all people. So I am delighted, but this event, as such, enables all of us to hear from shining examples from a number of different disciplines. Public lectures are designed to give a wider audience access to cutting-edge research and insightful knowledge on various subjects. When the university was created over a century ago by the people of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, it was for this very, very purpose, to use education to bring people together in order to create a better future. And by holding events such as this, we honour that legacy. So enough waffle from me, and I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker. Our eminent speaker today has been invited on the personal request of Professor Kunti in recognition of the remarkable contribution he's made in his role as the National Statistician, as well as services in the sector in many other leadership roles. Through examples such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and the Ukraine humanitarian response, Professor Sir Ian Diamond will explore the important role a National Statistics Institute plays in transforming decision-making at the heart of at the highest levels of government. He will showcase that the UK Statistic Authority strategy, known as Statistics for the Public Good, is at the heart of radical, ambitious, sustainable, and inclusive work that the Office of National Statistics is doing. Professor Sir Ian Diamond is the UK's National Statistician. He was chair of the Society Social Advisory Committee from 2018 to 2019. Sir Ian was knighted in 2013 for his services to social science and higher education. He was also Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Aberdeen. And there's many others, but I'll stop there. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Sir Ian Diamond to the stand to deliver his lecture, A National Statistical Institute in Response to a National Crisis. Thank you very much.
Chancellor, thank you very much for those very kind words. And distinguished guests, it's an enormous privilege for me to be here today. But before I start to talk, I did want to acknowledge my good friend Kamlesh Kunti, with whom I think the contribution that he personally made to our understanding during the pandemic that I talk about was absolutely immense. It's hard to say I had the privilege when you're going to a SAGE meeting. So I'll just say we were at SAGE meetings together for 2.5 years, and Kamlesh's contribution to our understanding and to therefore the advice that went to our political leaders was absolutely immense. And it has been a real privilege to work through him with the University of Leicester in many ways. And that's what I'm going to talk about quite a lot today. As the Chancellor said, we're going to talk about statistics. When I was invited at that stage by the Queen to become National Statistician, I was very, very clear that the one thing I worried about was that statistics were in the nation's service and were for the public good. And everything we care about at the Office of National Statistics is ensuring that what we do is in the public interest. We've got these 4 pillars: radical, ambitious, inclusive, and sustainable. They flow off my tongue really, really easily, and they also flow off I can tell you, you cannot get a paper sent to you these days from any one of my 5,000 colleagues which does not say, this paper is radical, for the following reason. And it's great, because it is because people are thinking about new ways to use data, indeed, new types of data. And what I'm going to talk about today is how ONS responded not only to the dreadful pandemic that has affected all our lives, but how we've, as a result, perhaps, been able to act agilely and to think broadly in all kinds of other areas. And one of the things I want you to take away today is that, if you like, what are data? Because when 50 years ago, when I was a budding statistician, I used to think, oh, right, we'll do a survey. That's what data are. You get some numbers and stuff like that. Now, data are surveys, data are administrative data, data are born digital data. You are going to see all of them this evening, and I would like you to feel that in many ways data are whatever you want them to be, but they are still requiring rigorous mathematical and statistical methodology, careful thinking, and a fundamental fact: no data are absolutely correct. Well, your age is probably reasonably correct, but anything else is subject to uncertainty. And actually understanding that uncertainty is central to what we do. I thought I'd just start by reminding you the sorts of things that we do, if you like, in peacetime. So we produce on a monthly basis an estimate of the employment rate and indeed the unemployment rate. And when you see that figure from the turn of the year at 3.7%, that's about as low as it gets. Anyone who's an economist would know that when you get there, that's basically zero because of the, if you like, the churn that there is in jobs anyway. And then GDP. I get asked so often. I love it when I can put up 0.0. Because what we do with GDP is we produce, the Bank of England wants the earliest possible indication. So international best practice, which was developed by this country, is we give you an initial result. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, with more data and information there, we give a revised result. But the Bank of England likes that early result. So if the early result is 0, I then spend 3 to 4 weeks with people ringing up. Bryony is with me, spends 3 to 4 weeks with journalists ringing her up, say, was it going to go up or down? And if your initial result was 2.8, nobody minds if it goes up or down 0.1. But as soon as you're at 0, oh my God, minus 0.1, oh, it's a recession. It's not a recession. It's about the same. The economy is doing as it is doing, flatlining. And also a lot of statistics about the population, UK population. There's been just last week enormous interest publicly in our migration figures and leading, if you like, the public discourse. And we worry hugely all the time that our information is as reliable as it could be. And no more time could it have been more reliable than when early in 2020 we were faced with the coronavirus pandemic. And I think it's worth saying, I just thought I'd just show you these two graphs of Europe. A lot of debate in 2020. Was the UK worse off than other countries or less? Well, what we did was calculate something called a relative age-specific mortality rate. And we did it for very small areas of about 200,000 people. And if you do that, then on the left-hand side, the darker areas, if blue is, it's about the same as it had been for the previous 5 years. A darker area was, it's much, much bigger than it was. The darker, the bigger. And so the week ending the 27th of March, when things were just starting to build, you can see that the UK is fairly blue, but Italy in the north was very, very, very dark, and central Spain was very dark. The point that I'm making is that if you go to the right-hand graph, the right-hand map, then Italy remains, this is now 17th of April, just 3 weeks later, Italy remains very, very highly focused in the north of Italy. Spain, very, very highly focused in central Spain. France, Paris and Strasbourg, and the UK right the way through. And I think it's a really important point if you remember that discourse during 2020 when people say, oh, the UK is doing much worse. The major reason for that was that the epidemic, sadly, was seeded right across the UK. Often, people coming back from the ski areas of Italy, for example, that wasn't the only reason I had to stress. And so we had, and about the only other country that did at that time was Belgium, a national epidemic where everyone else was localized. And indeed, if you move to these areas that we analyzed very, very carefully, of around about 200,000 people, so if you like, in London, for example, that would be Brent. And Brent in London was the area with the highest, sadly, mortality from COVID. But it was only just, I hate league tables or something so sadly, but it was only just around about 20th compared with other areas across Europe. And then as we went into, I'm not going to show you any more, but as we went into 2021 and then into 2022, the countries that really did sadly have much, much worse epidemics than our country were in Central Europe. And indeed, when we look now, then our country, nothing about this is great, but really around the middle of things. And I do think that says a lot to some of the very successful policies that were put in place. One of which was actually the only country in the world that had any data. And I'm going to take you back, because people think, right, there is a rumor out there that national statisticians are fairly dusty people who take about 10 years to do anything. And indeed, people think that about statisticians most of the time, I've got to tell you. And I want to take you back to the 10th of April-ish in 2020. And I was having a conversation. I've got to tell you, I'm hugely privileged to be following Patrick Vallance, who was just one of the greatest people I've ever worked with during this. And I was having a chat with Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, who many of you will have heard of. And the conversation went, well, what is the prevalence of COVID in our country? And you may recall at that time that test and trace was somewhat stretched. GPs were very, very stretched, and people were advised not to go to their GP. So, when Patrick said to me, well, what do we know about prevalence? We said, we haven't got a clue. Let's just be honest, we hadn't got a clue, because, for all the reasons I've just described. And so Patrick said, well, how are we going to find out? At this stage, as I started my lecture, nothing like a statistician like me. We could do a survey. And so it's some really, really good conversations with the Treasury, really good conversation, a man called Michael Webb, who was advising the Chancellor very carefully. Really good conversations with the Department of Health, and just said, look, okay, we need to know what the prevalence is in our country. We'll do a survey. And at this stage, I'm thinking, oh my God, what have I just said? Can we pull this off, So I rang a few people up. I stayed up a whole of one night. And with really strong help from some colleagues at the University of Oxford, particularly a woman called Sarah Walker, and from the Wellcome Trust, in almost no time at all, by which I mean 1 week, we went from the conversation with Patrick and Chris, through the design, through the ethics committees, through working out a field force, to having 20,000 swabs a week being taken. And of course, at that stage, I was on the phone to people, everyone I knew. If I knew a doctor, I'd rung them up and said, do you think people would let us take swabs, what we did was we had a design which was based on the household, because we were interested in whether there could be intra-household transmission, and also longitudinal, which meant we went back to the same households over time, because we wanted to know about the periodicity of the virus, and also whether people catch it again, and all kinds of things. So we did that, and it turns out that by the 26th of April, we had the first estimates. Then we make estimates then for once a week, and it became very, very good, but we're only doing them nationally. And then the Secretary of State for Health said in August 2020, well, okay, national's fine, but actually we want estimates really by age, and we want estimates by ethnicity, and we want estimates by region. So I said, well, that's going to mean doing 150,000 swabs a fortnight. And he said, fine, that'll be good. So I went back to my colleagues and said, you know that 20,000 we've been doing? It just became 150,000. And to their great credit, everybody said, oh, yeah, no worries. And we went for it. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland wanted to come in as well. And the slide that you've got there on the left-hand side is just the estimates from early 2022 through to when we stopped the survey in 23. And if you look at the top left for England, you can see that the curve goes up as high early in 2022 as 8%, indeed around Christmas 2021. When the Omicron came in, it got even a little higher than that. And I think it's worth saying, when you see those numbers, that we locked down in October 2020 when the numbers hit 2%. And you'll see that in that period, the numbers actually scarcely get ever below 2%. And the reason why we haven't had to lock down or anything is quite simply the brilliance of the vaccine rollout, and I can show some data in a little while from that, and the brilliance also of the medics in knowing how to treat this awful disease in such a way. We were also, I'm not going to spend time on it though, able to take a sample of blood. So we took swabs from everybody in the household over the age of 2, and we took a sample of blood from 10% of the households, and we used that to estimate antibody positivity, and the blue line there shows how, particularly post-November 21, with the vaccines really kicking on, almost the whole of the nation had positivity. I'd also say that you can't do everything with one set of data. And one of the things that we have done an enormous amount in the last few years at the ONS is link data. And linking data allows you to do so many wonderful things. I mean, which for 40 years of my career, I would just dream about. And so what we're able to do is, sadly, to link mortality data with vaccine data, and to understand the extent to which the vaccines were protecting against both, we can do it for ill health, serious illness, and mortality. And what you see here is from in January 21, on the left-hand side of that graph, you see that big turquoisey graph. That's mortality to people who are unvaccinated. The blue line is vaccinated people. You can immediately see it's low, and then over time, mortality drops for just about everybody because the Omicron virus, which really came in late 21 and 22, has much lower mortality. I'd also have to say that the other thing we can do was everyone who was positive, we zipped on the back of a motorbike the test to the Sanger Institute, and the genetics were undertaken. And that enabled us very quickly to understand new variants and to understand the pace at which those new variants were taking over. And again, I remember Patrick ringing me up in December 2020. I was saying, Ian, what do you know about a new variant in Kent? And I said, Patrick, I was just about to ring you up because we've just found a whole series of new variants in around Kent and East London, and we think it might be something new that we really ought to care about, and that was the Alpha variant. So, one survey, enormously put together, was able to really inform enormous amounts around the management of the pandemic. But that, of course, wasn't everything, because behaviour matters an enormous amount. And so we needed to find out not only about behaviour, but about how people were managing and how people were feeling around the pandemic. So we decided, again in March 2020, that we ought to ask people. There are things, you might think, gosh, you can do everything with administrative data these days, but you can't, because how do you ask people? I don't know how to find out how people are feeling. Are you feeling anxious? Without asking them. So we put together a survey which, as the right-hand block shows, goes out every week on a Wednesday. It's out for 4 days over the weekend. People respond online. We close it at 4 a.m. On a Monday. We clean and get all the population weighting done by 7 a.m. And the Prime Minister has it on his desk or her desk for a few weeks by midday. And I just think that kind of pace is, again, it's critical, because there's no point in us saying to the Prime Minister, well, I can tell you what was going on 6 months ago. They need to know on a weekly basis. And the questions have changed a lot. So we've asked about attitudes to face coverings and use of face coverings, social distancing, about whether you travel to work. I mean, a lot of people talk about working from home. And the Chancellor, I think, made a really important point about the impact that Kamlesh observed on people from ethnic minority backgrounds. But you need to remember that you can only work from home if you're in a job where that is possible to work from home. I am completely unclear how taxi drivers, bus drivers, security people work from home. And we observed, for example, people from Pakistani heritage working as taxi drivers having high mortality in the first place. And so, I think we need to remember that what our survey shows is that throughout the pandemic, only around 40% of people worked from home. And I think it's worth saying, all the discourse about working from home. Interestingly, during the middle of this, we published the results publicly for the 1921 census. They come out 100 years later. And of course, the 1921 census was just after the big flu epidemic. And at that time, London was fairly empty, because the aristocracy were not going to go anywhere near London, even to the debutante balls. I think I've said that right. I've been practicing for about 3 days. In case they caught this awful flu. And so, you actually have some strange numbers. And so I just feel that we need to recognise the same kinds of things happening 100 years later in terms of inequality. So that survey is really important. The other thing that we have done an enormous amount about is to really look carefully, sadly, at mortality. We publish on a weekly basis the number of deaths that are registered to us. It is compulsory as soon as you have a death certificate. As soon as the death certificate is the authorities send them straight to us, and we publish them on a weekly basis. Some of those drops that you see in the middle are when there's been something like a bank holiday and people don't send us them so quickly. But the bottom line is the blue lines are those involving COVID-19, and you can see early on in 2020 and again in the beginning of 2021 when that alpha variant really took place, enormous numbers, and indeed those numbers largely going above the, if you like, 5-year average, which is the dotted line, the black dotted line you can see going along. The other thing that we've shown, and which we believe we will see as we move forward, is that there are likely to be increased deaths over a period of time because of the lack of early diagnosis of some cancers, and we've also seen some increase in cardiovascular disease. But the other thing that I think flows into what I've already said, which is around ethnicity, is also deprivation. So we linked the death registration to census data and to valuation office agency data, which tells you about housing and tells you about deprivation of local areas. And I'm afraid that the right-hand graph there, which has the most deprived areas, is mortality, age-specific, so controlling for age, mortality, but the most deprived, and it's a fairly obvious curve down to the least deprived areas. Again, making the point that I have already made. The other thing which I think is important to recognize, I could give you an hour on the next bit, and so I'm going to do it in about 40 seconds, but I think this is really quite important. The blue, the two blues, the light blue at the top is what we call a relative risk, and it's relative to white British people. So this I could give you for all kinds of different ethnicities, but I'll just show you this one. This is between June 21 and December 21, the second wave, and again, and this is mortality. And the top line, the top light blue, and you can see it's a bit bigger than 2, says that for Black Caribbean men, the mortality levels were about 2.5 times, 2 1/3 times bigger than those of white men. But we know that Black Caribbean men, as an overall group, are more likely to have comorbidities, more likely perhaps to live in more deprived areas, and more likely to live in poorer housing. So by linking these data, as I say, with housing data, with socioeconomic data, and with health data to get comorbidities, you know, I sort of say this, but this is pretty hard stuff. By linking those and then redoing the analysis, you can see that there is still an elevated risk, but it is now down to about 1.8 times that of. So that's controlling for that. But then, on top of that, let's look at vaccination status. And when you then control for vaccination status and run the analysis again, the difference, I mean, that is, the statistician in me says that's not a real difference, okay? That's the very dark blue at the bottom. What that led to, just in case you think that government wasn't listening, when we showed these data, government just said, well, we absolutely need to really make sure that our vaccination messages are reaching different groups. And I think the Government Communication Service did a really, really good job. And you may recall some really key people, Lenny Henry, for example, really, really putting a lot of effort into improving the vaccination status across different groups. So just to say that we really were trying to make sure that policy was happening. And then the last thing I was going to talk about on COVID was this, which is everything on this slide is joint with Kamlesh and colleagues at the University of Leicester, and it is work that we have done using that big survey and asking people about symptoms And because of that longitudinal, that going back to the same period over time design, say, well, have you still got those symptoms? And able properly to make self-reported, okay, I take the point about it's self-reported, estimates of long COVID. And we're estimating, as you can see, that, I mean, the different colours are just sort of slightly different methods of data collection that we use as we try to become, well, basically save some money. But the bottom line is that we're estimating not far off 2 million people having self-reported long COVID. And then on the right-hand side, say, well, okay, what's the impact? And around about 1 in 5 of those people. So for many people, they're saying, okay, I've had the symptoms for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, longer, but it doesn't impact on me a lot. That's the big graph on the right. But for 1 in 5 people, it is impacting on their lives a lot. And I'm sure most people in this room know of someone who has really had their life for a very long period impacted upon by long COVID. Then, just as we were coming out of the COVID towards the end of 2021, we started to look at the labour market. A lot of people, you may recall, at the beginning of the pandemic said, this is the end of the economy as we know it. There won't be any jobs. No one will get there. There will be gazillions and gazillions of redundancies. The world's going to end tomorrow. Or words to that effect. And I think the government, and I think everyone would say, the government's response and the Treasury's response with the furlough scheme really, I think, was incredibly good. I could show you all kinds of stuff about redundancies and how there weren't the redundancies that were expected. But we started to look very much at employment. The top left-hand graph there shows the employment rate, which is the overall percentage of people aged 16 to 64 in employment. And you see that that was a little over 76%, and it dropped down as the start of the pandemic came along, and then steadily came up, but hadn't got right up as high as you might have expected. Bottom left, the unemployment rate, you've already seen that got to 3.7%. So it went up, but then came down to really pretty much record lows. But the top right, economic inactivity, that's people aged 16 to 64 who are neither in employment nor looking for employment. And you can see that's gone up a little bit. So, gosh, nothing like a statistician to say, well, that's interesting, wonder why. So a few deep dives and everything like that. And you see the graph at the bottom, the histogram on the bottom right-hand side. And the message very much there is this is really focused amongst the over 50s. 500,000 over 50s working before the pandemic came out of the labour force and didn't go back in. Now, remember my 0 on GDP. My colleagues get super nervous when I say this, so can I just say, rule of thumb, very rough, please don't quote me, but I'm amongst friends, I know you wouldn't. But 100,000 people is about 0.1 of a GDP in work. So those 500,000 people who came out of the labour force were back in the labour force, your GDP's at 0.5. Just like that. Well, it's not quite just like that, but anyway. So that was really, really important. So again, I just wanted, though, to point to that little number, 18 to 24. I don't want to make a big thing of it, but we are starting to see an increase in economic inactivity amongst 18 to 24s. A bit, I mean, not completely, but a bit towards young women and a bit towards mental ill health. So we think there are real challenges for our country there. But the big challenge over the 50s, so by this time, we're good at doing things at pace. So we stood up and got an over 50s lifestyle survey in the field. In fact, we did 2, but we were in the field and out of the field and analysed and on the Prime Minister's desk within 1 month. And I won't go too much into the slide on the left, but the bottom line is that while some people were saying, I can afford to retire, and I think I will, a lot of people were saying, look, I've got care responsibilities. We've got an increasing number of what we call sandwich carers, of people in the 50s, elderly parent and grandchildren, or indeed children. So I've got caring responsibilities. I would go back into the labour force, A, if I got paid enough, B, if it was flexible, and C, if it didn't have to be full-time. That's the strong message. And so some big employers have really followed that up. The Chancellor has put a lot of effort into encouraging ways of bringing people back into the labour force, highlighted particularly at senior medics with issues around pensions. So the bottom line is real pushes to encourage this group of the over 50s back into the labour force, because we should also say that there's been a bit of a flight from the labour force of EU in the last couple of years. That's the dark line, although we have started to see an increase in the number of non-EU workers, and in some areas I could talk all day about HGV drivers and Kazakhstanis instead of Poles, but there has been a bit of a transference from EU workers to non-EU workers. But certainly what this means is that there are enormous numbers of vacancies, and I just showed you this. I just thought I'd show you this graph just to show the breadth of the type of data we use. So we're using here online vacancy data. I can do Indeed, I can do Burning Glass, I can do any type of online. And what basically we show in those graphs on the right-hand side, you can see the top line is accounting and finance, catering and hospitality, and whatever. And then the dark blue at the top of each one is 2021. And I can show you for 2022, and it gets even higher. And so it's not just, if you like, when you hear about HGV drivers, yes, there is an issue for HGV drivers, although the market has responded. So a year on, HGV driver vacancies are at 20% higher salaries than they were a year ago, 20% higher salaries than a year ago. And we're not hearing so much of an issue. It is another, but right across the labour force, we have vacancies everywhere. And of course, at the same time, people want a job because we've got a cost of living crisis. I'm not going to spend a long time. We measure inflation using all kinds of ways, but what we've tried to do with inflation is to identify those people who are most impacted. And the histogram there on the right-hand side of the slide shows some of it, not unsurprisingly. The further out on the right it goes, then that's the higher your chance of reporting financial vulnerability. And we've got a multi-level way of looking at financial vulnerability. I don't say it's surprising that the highest ones are those people who are renting, or those people who are on salaries of 10 to 15,000 a year. I don't think that's rocket science, but my point in showing you is that we're able to do this and to identify it. And we've also put a lot of work into identifying inflation rates for different groups of people. And so, for example, we took value goods, if you like, essential goods or value, the cheapest in every supermarket, and looked at the inflation for those goods. And what you find is that the inflation for those goods is about the same as the inflation for all goods. But, of course, underlying that, there are all kinds of differentials. So, for example, pasta and vegetable oil, the inflation has been 40%. Beef mince, orange juice, almost negative. inflation. So my point is that just having one number is always difficult to look at, and you can see on the right-hand side the item level changes for the last year or so. As I said, vegetable oil and pasta at the top, and beef mince and orange juice at the bottom. Everything else in the middle, you pay your money and you take your choice. But we also worry very much about consumer spending. And so what we look at is about 98% of all credit and debit card transactions every day. I stress in a privacy and ethically enhanced way, but enabling us to look at spending on different things. So we divide that into what we call delayable, basically non-food, social, staple, and work-related. And you can see the extent. Everything is relative to an index of February 2020, just before the pandemic. And so you can see, if you start on the left-hand side, the dark blue, which is social, crashes right down and sort of comes back up. I'll just show you one of the things that we can do. If you look about two-thirds of, this is a pointer. If you look about two-thirds of the way across with the turquoise, the green line, which is work-related, you might see an enormous spike. And that spike was September 2021, when at midday on a Friday, the chief executive of BP put out a tweet saying, got a bit of a problem with 3 petrol stations in Essex, very a bit short. The nation filled their car up. The nation filled their car up. And you can see that spike in fuel-related spending, and we were able to be in the Treasury within 48 hours saying, look, this is what's happened. My point being that you can understand these things very, very, very quickly. We also can look at footfall very, very quickly using cameras, and we do. So on the left-hand side there, the purple is 2020, and that's retail footfall. You can see it crashing down and sort of not ever quite building right up. But by 2022, which is the green, and then the beginning up to, you can see the 87.9 number, that was 2023 up until just a couple of weeks ago, 87.9% of where we were in the beginning of the pandemic. And then there's some stuff I won't mention on Revolut cards that we use. But I also wanted to say something about how the UK's amazing humanitarian response to the invasion of Ukraine from Russia. We were able very, very quickly to say to the government, when I say very quickly, within 40 minutes, what the distribution of the Ukrainian diaspora was in England. You can see the right-hand graph there. So that's Ukrainian-born usual residents of England and Wales by local authority, because the government was expecting that most Ukrainian refugees would go to places where there were Ukrainians. Again, I don't say that's rocket science, but having those data and therefore being able to work with local authorities, as I say, within 40 minutes was incredibly important. And we were also at the same time did a survey which was really speaking to both Ukrainians and to their hosts. We've done a couple of surveys and really understanding how they were experiencing. The first one said a lot about the problems of getting GP data. The second one said, oh, we've got a GP. So we were able to follow over time and work very closely with our colleagues who are managing the response very, very carefully. And I'm just going to finish with one slide, if I may, which just to talk about population, because in 2021 we did a census. Thank you very, very much for all of you who filled in your census form. That was a brilliant piece of civic duty, the like of which this country has not seen. We had the best response rate ever, so thank you so much for doing that. And here's some early response from this. I just wanted to make a couple of points. So the darker the area, right, so the left-hand map of England and Wales, the darker the area is, the higher the proportion aged 65 and over. And the right hand, the more dark, is the population aged 85 and over. And it is a really important policy piece, because if you look at the left-hand one, you'll see the South Coast has got lots. Yes, but that was the case because people retired to the South Coast. About 25 years ago, people stopped retiring to the South Coast. So you'll see the dark blue in the South Coast is the same, because if you're over 85, you're over 65 by definition. And you can see that the South Coast is about the same in both graphs. People stopped retiring to the South Coast. Why? It's full of old people, of course. So where I'll go is I'll retire initially to Herefordshire and to the southern lakes. And what you see then is, if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see some dark blue around Herefordshire and some dark blue around North Wales and some dark blue around the southern lakes, all of which now really impacting on health service needs and demand in those areas in a big way. And what do we know about the future? Well, the future is to say, well, okay, they're full of old people, so where are people going now? And for the first time, we've been able to show that on the left-hand side you can see Mid Wales, the North Lakes, and Yorkshire is a place where people are increasing. The Yorkshire Dales, very nice, Richmond, if anyone's been there, full of 65 to 70-year-olds, which is brilliant, but they're going to get old. And so you've got a 15-year, I would argue, opportunity in health services in those areas. And this is some of the conversation that Chris Whitty and I have a lot about what are the future things that we can learn from these kinds of data. And you may say, well, do people take notice of them? I'm showing this slide and some more slides which talk about families, talk about children, talk about care, to the permanent secretaries of the 10 biggest departments next Monday to talk about the policy implications of demography from ONS data. So what I've tried to do is, I hope I've convinced you that we use a vast array of data. We use it all in ways which are for the public good. And what about the future? We will respond to crises. We'll respond agilely. We're also thinking about better ways of doing the population. And to come back to my GDP, we are now absolutely passionate that we will move beyond GDP. What do I mean by that? In 1960, early 1960s, the late presidential candidate of America, Robert Kennedy, said, GDP measures everything except that which is important. While I wouldn't go quite as far as him, it makes a lot of sense. And so what we're building in as well is human capital, demography and education, environmental degradation and well-being into GDP figures, so that we will really have a picture of our society, the health of our society, and our well-being of our society. And I think if we get there, then we will be ahead of the rest of the world in what we do, but we will be, again, serving the nation in the way that we want to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Ian. I wanted to thank you publicly at a number of levels. First of all the collaborations you've had with the University of Leicester. It's been great working with your team. I think secondly, the amount of work you've put in. I used to see you, Chris, Patrick working tirelessly 7 days a week. Under your leadership, the work that ONS has done and the contribution it makes in terms of the policy decisions that were made to improve the lives of people who were affected with COVID. And finally, making the time to come along today and giving us this Chancellor's lecture. A great statistician is when they can give complex data simply and accessible to the public audience, and you did that beautifully, so thank you very much. I think we're very proud of UK, and many of us here work with big data. And when we go abroad, we go there with hands held really highly, say, we have the best data in the world. And you've shown what can be done, not just during COVID, but outside of COVID. Thank you again. Thank you. We have some time for questions. If we can make the questions short, if you can tell us who you are as well. If you put your hand up, we've got some roving mics there. Got one.
Thank you. Anna Hansel, I'm an environmental epidemiologist and we've been working with large data sets for a lot of years, and I'd really like to echo being proud of the UK data. It's fantastic. One of the areas I work in is air pollution, and one of the things I'm working on at the moment actually is with Faye Napoleon, who I know worked with Kamlesh quite a lot, but we've been looking at air pollution and COVID mortality to try and unravel some of that. It's really as a lead into the question, which is the pandemic offered a fantastic insight into how our national data could be used for health analyses. And I'm wondering how that's going to be built on and whether the data might become more accessible, because currently the data are being used for COVID. And certainly from an air pollution perspective, it would be a fantastic resource if we can try and marry up some of our air pollution expertise with the ONS linked data sets to look at health.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, the simple answer, I'm so pleased you're working on air pollution, because I think it's really super important. And I know Chris is here, and I mean, I've worked with colleagues from Loughborough on environmental noise for a while. And again, I think there are real issues there around health. But you make a really good point. We were able to do the work that I talked about using health data because of special provisions to do with the COVID pandemic. And so we had to get permission for each study, the ethics and everything, but it was always so long as it was for the pandemic. I'm very passionate that, and many people in the NHS are, that we ought to properly privacy enhanced, properly ethically be able to do this for more studies in the public interest. And we're working very closely with the NHS and with Health Data Research UK to be able to take that forward. The one thing I would say, which I didn't say in my talk, but I am really personally every moment of every day aware of, is that these are people's data. And that public engagement is something that is a critical part of what we do and others do. And when I talk about public engagement, I really mean engagement. I do not mean, for those of a certain age, a Tomorrow's World type engagement where it was always a man, wasn't it, in a white coat stands up and says, this is safe. So we do a lot of, and when we engage with people, not just about, if I went up to you and say, can I have your health data for the last 25 years, you'd tell me to get lost. But if we sit down and have a conversation about what it's going to be used for, and if the public are involved in the decision making, and if all the ethics are fine, then the public say to us, of course, that makes sense. So I believe that we now are in a position as a nation where we can have that conversation where the transparency is critical, in the public interest is critical, and the engagement is critical. And I believe that over the next year or so we will be able to have the kind of access to enable the sorts of absolutely important work that you describe on air pollution to go ahead.
Thank you. Nilesh.
Go for it.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm Nilesh Samani. I'm Professor of Cardiology here at Medical Directors BHF. We met on Zoom calls.
Yes, that's right, I remember.
So just wanted to make a comment first around the excess death. The BHF will be putting out in the next few weeks.
The station there have been 100,000 excess deaths from cardiovascular diseases using the data that ONS have produced. So trying to understand that is going to be quite important. But the question I had for you was around the next crisis. And the climate change is coming. So really would like an understanding of what the ONS is doing at this right now around this big issue around climate change and how it might affect us.
Yeah. Again, I didn't have time to go into that in great detail, but the short answer is the government has been excellent in saying we need to make sure that for the next crisis, the data flows are ready. I've publicly said that at the beginning of the pandemic, data were flying in from everywhere. And I used to have conversations with Don Cummings. I said, look, here, you've got a data deluge here, but actually you need insight. And that's where we tried very quickly to get to. And so now you're going to tell me that we don't, there will be the classic unknown. But for what the government has as the national risk register, which includes environmental stuff as well, then there is a real plan which has been operationalized of what data would you need at pace, and we are working very, very closely to ensure that those data exist. Now, rightly, you will say, but what about the unknowns? Well, you can't plan for everything. But we really are working very hard to make sure that we are, we've got those data flows flowing, but B, we're agile, as you can see, to respond very quickly when we need to. So I'm not saying everything's perfect, but I am saying that the government has been very good at really saying we need to be preparing. And the environment is a critical one. And that the point that I made at the end about beyond GDP is really important, because if we're measuring on a quarterly basis the environmental degradation in the country, then you actually are able to see that happening. But of course, the other argument you would make, I hope rightly, is that this country can't do everything itself. And just next week, I'm chairing for the United Nations a big piece around how do we measure environmental degradation in an international way. And that means enabling all countries, statistical institutes, some not as sophisticated as ours, to be able to make those measurements. So this is an urgent issue, but we are really worrying about it.
And a couple more questions, one there, and then I'll come there.
I'm here.
Hi there.
Hilary Hearnshaw, a happily retired academic, former colleague of Camwish. I wonder about the ownership of your data. Do you ever buy data, and do you ever sell data?
We try very much not to sell data, because we believe it's in the public interest. The only data we have bought is telephony data. And that is actually quite useful, particularly for local authorities. Now, we are arguing with the telephone companies that they don't want to be paying us. But we can get telephone data in 1 kilometre squares. Why is that important? If you talk to a local authority, talk to Leicester, what Leicester are interested about is, well, they're interested in the number of usual residents, but more importantly, often, local authorities say to us, I'm really interested in how many people we've got to provide services for in the middle of the day. And telephony data are really a very good way of understanding, and you don't just count the telephones, but we've got a modelling way of taking that forward. So those are the only data we use. We did actually use those telephony data very much, again, in a sad situation in our late Queen's lying in state, which was enabling us to be able to model the length of the queue, the speed of the queue, and therefore when to stop the queue. And again, those kind of data, being able to do it at pace, are quite helpful. Those are the only data we buy. And I hope in the future that we won't be buying much longer. Because we do have a lot of conversations with people. So, for example, we get scanner data from all the supermarkets on a daily basis, that billions and billions and billions of things. We've done that through detailed conversations, and about privacy and all those kinds of things. And I've got to tell you, I've had some really entertaining conversations with American lawyers at times, but we have made that progress. Thank you.
Kent Woods, I thought it was a really fascinating lecture. I want to pick up the issue about the willingness of the public to contribute data for public good. I used to run the MHRA, and for 20 years we hosted the General Practice Research Database, which is now receiving about 20% of routinely gathered clinical data from primary care, which is pseudonymized.
Sure.
And we've repeatedly gone out to see whether this is acceptable to the population of those practices, with remarkably little resistance. And it was only in recent years that the whole question of NHS data being commercialized, sold, whatever, has generated a great deal of angst. But my experience is that actually the underlying resistance to this is extremely small. And I wonder whether the impact of the pandemic will have been to explain to people the actual public value of being able to analyse properly protected, confidentiality protected clinical data.
I think you're absolutely. I think it has been, and the good news is, I mean, you mentioned something called pseudonymization, which I won't go into with colleagues, but just to say we're much better at that. We don't need to do that anymore, and people also worry, oh, my data are going to a data lake somewhere. They actually don't. They can stay, and we just link them when we need them. So that the thing that I lie awake at night worrying about, and my security director says I shouldn't, but I do, is the cybersecurity issues. We get tens of thousands of hits all the time. But we work very closely to protect, as does the NHS, as does everyone else. But it is very, very clear that the more you talk to people, and indeed you talk to the privacy campaigners, that those whole principles that I just described of ethics, of in the public interest, of transparency, and of public involvement in the decision making are such that people say that's fine so long as we know how it's being used and we know that the privacy things and the ethics are all there and it's in the public interest. And it may not impact on me, but it may impact on someone I know, and wouldn't that be brilliant? And some of the things, particularly on rare, I don't need to tell you this, but on rare diseases, you need national data.
Okay, there's lots of questions, but in view of time...
This is such good fun. We can do.
We're going to carry on.
If people don't mind, we'll do one or two.
You sure? Okay, well,
People don't mind.
I've got one at the back there.
Don't feel embarrassed about leaving.
Okay, so one there, one here. We'll start here.
Mine's a quick one because you talked, well, thank you for a very, very interesting and accessible lecture. But my question is about, following on from what you said about public engagement with data. I remember during lockdown, when Leicester's lockdown was extended, and as part of the council here, with our own public health teams, the first we knew about it was when it appeared as a flash on the television, and we thought perhaps it was a mistake because the data hadn't been shared. And I remember campaigning online with Give Us the Data as a campaign so that we could engage with it and then take appropriate action within our super output areas where there might be need, rather than the vague data that we had, which was citywide. And it actually led, I think, to an enhanced response to that in Leicester once we did get that information, so that we knew which communities to go to, and we were able to do door-to-door testing and engage in those areas. So it shows the importance.
You've got to get down to the area that, you mentioned lower super output areas. Those, for colleagues, are areas of around 400 households, and we are now If I'd had more time, I would have talked about some of the work that we do with those lower super out, because that's when you really do get down to, if you like, some homogeneity. You know, you talk about big areas, well, rich people live next to poor people, it all gets a bit, the average isn't so good. When you get down to 400 households, you can actually start to make some progress in really understanding where you need to focus. And I thought Leicester helped us in that, and I hope in the future we will be a much better place.
We get it sooner.
Message received.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Deb Watson. I work in public health and was working for Public Health England in the East Midlands and now the UK Health Security Agency through the pandemic. Thank you for your lecture, and also thank you for the fantastic work you did through the pandemic, having been one of many, many people using the data. It was really, really fantastic to have it as we worked through all of the complexities. I just wanted to ask you, you've shone a light very much on the direct impacts of COVID in the data that you've shared this evening. I wonder what work is going on to analyse statistically the impact of the indirect impacts of COVID on things like the impacts on education, the impacts on people who lost time in screening programmes and indeed taking up care and waiting lists and so on, and a whole range of other things around isolation and mental health problems and so on. I just wonder what analysis...
It's a really important point, and certainly, you know, education is a really important area, and what we now have in the Department for Education that I am privileged to chair is called the Unit for Future Skills, and that's got all pupil data, it's got all exam data. It then, for everybody of 40 and younger, takes you up with what you subsequently do. So we are looking very carefully at what we can do there to understand the impact over time of the pandemic, not only on schools, but on higher education, where I think there are some really important areas. Secondly, we did a piece in 2020 and repeated it in 2021, which looked at the potential long-term impacts. And indeed, in the 2021, we built quite a lot of extra ill health as a result of the then expected massive economic depressions. Now, the good news is we didn't have that extended economic depression, but we're looking very carefully now at excess cancer, excess cardiovascular that was mentioned by colleagues there, and really trying to understand the longer term impacts, as well as working with Kamlesh on long COVID, which is so incredibly important.
So we've got a program work with HDI UK and ONS because we think there'll be more people dying because of the indirect effects. 2 years of not having their blood pressure measured, their glucose measured, regular risk factor measured. So that's ongoing work.
I don't do forecasts. I am a civil servant.
Two really quick questions. I've got one there and then one at the back. We better close that.
Hi there, I'm Gareth Jones. I'm a retired veterinary ophthalmologist. I'd wonder if you could just share confidentially what you think of Boris.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I've been public and say, we worked on a daily basis. The data were always listened to and taken incredibly seriously, and it would be completely wrong of me, given the subject, to say I enjoyed it, but I felt very much that statistics were being listened to.
Thank you. And a final question.
Given we're talking about the person, I also had many, many, many extremely deep conversations with was Dominic Cummings, who was completely committed to improving the data literacy of our nation and the way in which data were used.
Thank you for a lovely and fantastic lecture. I'm Andre Ng. I'm a cardiologist and clinical academic here at the university. I'd just like to ask a controversial subject, but you just declared that you don't do forecasts. AI. Obviously, AI loves data, and you've got tons of it. Yeah. I presume there's a fair bit of AI done in the forecasting, and how is the AI activities being streamlined in ONS in a positive manner?
Yeah, no, really, really important question. And just for example, I'm sure here at the University of Leicester, alongside all higher education institutions, you're concerned with the impact of large language models. Now, we at ONS recognise that let's just imagine, just pretend, that we put next week's inflation data and said, write us a story about it, write us a story, but they're in there. So the security of large language models is something that worries us enormously, and we are leading alongside the government central data office on the impact or the potential impact of large language models on government. Because at one level, one wants to use the very best opportunities, but at another level, you've got to be aware of the security, you've got to be aware of all the impacts. But we use an awful lot of very, very sophisticated modelling in what we do, and we really make sure that the security of all of that is incredibly high. Now, what's the future? I have no idea. The one thing I am completely aware of is that in the year, sadly, when Boyle died, Boyle's law is ever more clear. So what we can do now, the things I talked about here, the way we link data now. In the year 2000, a woman who still works for ONS, Janet Wolford, and I worked out how to match linked data. At that stage, we were told we were mad for even thinking to do it. I was an academic at the time. I said, oh, we can do this. Yeah, I was always good at saying, this will take a month. 6 months later, we just about got it working. And yet now, it's just routine stuff. So I'm not an expert in what is the future going to be, except that it will be there. And I think we need to go into the future with our eyes open. I'm a huge believer in we understand the ethics of what we do. And I'm also a huge believer in making sure that we're on the cutting edge to make sure that it is in the public interest of what we're doing. But I'm always prepared to be told what the future is. And just that unit for future skills that I mentioned, doing a lot of thinking about what the impact is going to be on certain jobs. And at one level, some jobs are not going to be needed, but new jobs will be needed. And when people say, oh, but that's never happened before, I just kind of remember nail making, and stuff like that. So you could call me a ridiculous optimist, but I do believe that we'll still be here in a long time.
Thank you, Ian. We've had 1.5 hours of Ian standing here. There's a drinks reception downstairs, so please hold your questions for now, and I'm sure you'll be here for a few more minutes to answer those questions. I'll hand you over to our President and Vice Chancellor, Nishan, to say the closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I won't keep you long because I think you've all been very good to listen to Ian, and I can see a lot of people have questions to ask. So I think, as Kamalesh said, please join us for drinks, and you can carry on the conversation. All I want to do is echo what Kamalesh said. So, Darren, thank you very much for coming and giving this talk. As the Chancellor said, these are prestigious lectures, and we invite eminent people, and that really is challenging sometimes, getting into their diaries, but also them finding the time to come and give a lecture that is engaging as this. I think what Ian has managed to illustrate is the power of statistics, the power of public engagement, and the power of various agencies working together for the public good. I think there is more that we all can play a part in that. So very much appreciate what you've done. I think anybody thought statistics is a boring subject, I think you persuaded, no, there is a lot of fun in statistics. I also want to say thank you to our Chancellor. Thank you very much for coming here to introduce, and I think we have your official installation in July, but we managed to still get you twice into the university, one for our alumni dinner a few days ago, and again today. Thank you very much for coming and being part of this event. And thank you all for very much being part of this evening's lecture. It's always fun having people here, having engaging discussion, and there were lots of interesting questions, and I think, as you mentioned, we will continue to have that discussion in a few minutes. Can I also thank our events team for their work in preparing for this lecture and putting on a good show. So thank you all very much. Stay around, have a drink, continue the conversation, and on behalf of the University of Leicester, thank you for a fantastic Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture.